Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion of the documentary Unrepresented. My name is Tori Gorman, and I am the Policy Director for the Concord Coalition. Concord is a nonpartisan, nonprofit grassroots organization whose mission is to educate the public about the federal budget and the dangers of our unsustainable debt, and to advocate for generationally responsible fiscal policy. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if during this discussion you have a question for our panelists, please submit it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have an hour together here today, and if we have time, I would like to ask a few questions from the audience. Second, today's program is being recorded and it will be posted on the Concord Coalition website. So if you want to share it with friends and family after the fact, you'll be able to link to our page. So let's get started. Unrepresented is an award-winning documentary from 2019 that reveals how in the United States, the eternal campaign finance law, and influence peddling all combine to amplify the voices of special interests above those of the American voter. The result is a political system where policy outcomes struggle to reflect the will of the people. With us today is a very impressive panel to reflect on the themes in Unrepresented. I'm going to introduce them one by one, and when I do, I'd like to ask each one of our panelists to take a few moments and share with us a key observation or an important lesson or some takeaway from the film that you'd like to highlight. And I'd like to begin by introducing Andrew Rodney. Andrew is the executive producer of Unrepresented. He also wrote and produced the documentary Divorce in 2010. Andrew is the COO for Detroit Forming in Southfield, Michigan. He's also a tutor in Detroit schools and a global member of Gen Next, a group dedicated to confronting challenges that face future generations. Welcome, Andrew, and congratulations on the film. I've watched it multiple times and it's very compelling. So what would you like to share with our viewers today?
Well, thank you, Tori. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Bob and everybody behind the scenes for putting this on, and Maya and Dave for joining the panel and supporting a great group like the Concord Coalition, and everybody who's taken the time to tune in today. I made the film in large part to bring attention to the deficit, because I feel, and just debt spending in general, because I feel that that's kind of too lost in discussions today. And the role that it plays in really helping to fund the broken, as we describe in the film, the corruption cycle that is preventing our government from hearing the voices of ordinary Americans and being accountable to them. In this last election cycle, the count, I believe, was somewhere around $14 billion that was spent on campaigns. The official number somewhere around there. But this year, they're going to spend, I believe, somewhere in the $5 trillion. I'm sorry, I would be way wrong, and that it could be $7 trillion that they'll spend when all of these, large stimulus pass. And that's, so it's important to look at campaign finance, and it's important to look at the role of lobbying, but the role that endless, limitless debt spending plays in preventing or helping to stop Congress and representatives from hearing and representing the American people better is something that I was really trying to highlight in making Unrepresented.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks so much for taking time and to be with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce a rock star in budget world, Dave Walker. Dave is a nationally and internationally recognized expert on fiscal responsibility, government transformation and accountability, human capital, and retirement security. He has over 40 years of executive level experience in the public and private and nonprofit sectors, including heading up 3 federal government agencies. I personally met David when he was the Comptroller General of the United States and CEO of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Essentially, he was the nation's accountant, and he held that position with distinction for almost 10 years. So welcome, Dave. And the mic to you. Is there a lesson or a moment in the film that really left an impression on you, or something that you'd like to highlight?
Well, thank you, Tori. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm coming to you from my office, teach economics and national security. Let me give you a few opening remarks, and we'll go to Q&A. I know after everybody else has a chance to speak. I came to Washington the first time in government in 1983. I've been in and out of government, and it's gone straight downhill since 1983, both with regard to our finances as well as the political situation. In my view, we face a number of sustainability challenges in this country: fiscal sustainability, education, environment, healthcare, infrastructure, tax system, but most importantly, our political system. We now have a republic that is not representative of nor responsive to the general public. It's not just a matter of partisanship, it's a matter of the great ideological divide. There's virtually no overlap between the two parties, and yet over 40% of registered voters in America are unaffiliated with either major political party, which I count myself as part of that. We need a lot more leadership, we need a lot more integrity, and we need a lot more stewardship with regard to our government. And last thing I'll say is that I had the opportunity in 2012 to do a 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour with Alice Rivlin, God rest her soul, and others. And we addressed our fiscal challenges, government transformation challenges, and political challenges, and achieved over 80% support from representative groups of voters on a range of reforms, which I'm happy to get into as part of the Q&A session if you want. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Dave comes out swinging like I knew you would. Next, I'd like to introduce Maya McGinnis. Maya is the president of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. She is a leading budget expert and a political independent. She has worked closely with lawmakers from both parties, and she is a trusted resource on Capitol Hill. And if she looks familiar to you, it's probably because you've seen her providing expert commentary and analysis on CNN, MSNBC, or CNBC's Squawk Box. She also appears in the film that we're discussing today. So welcome, Maya. And I actually want to ask you two quick questions. One, did you earn a SAG card for your appearance in the documentary? And what struck you most about the film?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so apologize for my my challenges on the tech side today, which I seem to have every day. And thanks. Yeah, no, that's the closest I've been to being a movie star, but it was pretty exciting. Now, am I frozen?
But we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So I'm sure I'm frozen with my eyes closed, but I will proceed. Let me just quickly say that the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget has actually built up a side project called Fix Us, because we are so concerned that you can't make progress on any of these deep policy issues amidst the country that is so divided, dysfunctional, and distrustful, the 3Ds. And I like this film so much because it gets at that in a whole new framing. And for me, I guess I had two favorite parts. One was how well and cleverly it weaves the issue of fiscal challenges and our inability to govern in a fiscally responsible way with all these other issues of undue influence in politics, money in politics, the failure of the ways that we budget and don't abide by the budget process anymore. So that I thought was a really useful take on how these issues are all so intertwined. And just the second one was that I also, at the time, this was before COVID, traded my son, I think it was like FIFA 19, in order for him to come watch the film with me. This was not he was 15 at the time, not his idea of fun. And he said the movie was so great, so interesting, and that he learned so much that he actually wanted to get it into the local high school system. So as every parent knows, anything that makes your kid think you're cool instead of a total loser is a huge win. But seriously, he really liked the film. And so both I learned things from it and my teenage son did. And I think it succeeded in delivering a really important message to a lot of different age groups and groups. So I'm a huge fan of the film, regardless of the fact that I also got to be in it.
Thanks, Maya, and thanks for joining us today. Last, but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Bob Bixby. Bob is the executive director of the Concord Coalition, and he's not just our leader at Concord, he is the Concord Coalition, having served with the organization in some capacity since its inception in 1992. Bob also served as a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force, otherwise known as the Domenici-Rivlin Commission, which actually produced a model plan for comprehensive fiscal reform. So welcome, Bob. And what thoughts would you like to share with us about Unrepresented today?
Well, thank you very much, Tori, and my congratulations, Andrew, for the film. It really does a terrific job. And we need videos like this because it helps in the learning process. When you introduce Dave, it reminds me of our fiscal wake up tour that Dave and I were on with other people for about 5 years back in 2005 to 10. And you mentioned Dave was a rock star, and he was cited in the Washington Post as our rock star. So we used to joke with him about that, and I think he liked the title. So he's still rocking away. You know what I guess what struck me about the film is that it's one other reason, this money in politics is one other reason to lament the breakdown of the budget process, which is totally broken down. I mean, there is no more federal budget process. And if you don't have a budget process, you have no mechanism in place to set priorities and force trade-offs. You just have, like the Wild West. And so that leads to a proliferation of tax breaks. They're sometimes called tax expenditures. And if you look at areas that the film dealt with on the spending side, you look at healthcare and defense. And those are a couple of areas that are noted for having bloated budgets. I mean, the Pentagon's budget, when Dave was Comptroller General, they were always saying that they couldn't audit the Pentagon's books. With the healthcare costs, it's well known that the American healthcare system is far more costly than other nations, with no better outcomes. And those areas are particularly, along with the tax code, vulnerable to lobbying. So when I look ahead, what concerns me is that we now have a new administration with a big new agenda, lots of new opportunities for lobbying, lots of new money being injected into the system for a lot of new initiatives. We are already on an unsustainable budget track going into this. And maybe we can talk about that before. And there's no budget process to keep it all in place. So I think there are a lot of good issues, daunting issues, but very good issues highlighted in this film.
Thanks, Bob. So I'd like to start this first round of questions to talk a little bit about the problems that this film identifies. And Andrew, I'd like to start with you. Money in politics isn't new. So I'm wondering what compelled you to make this film now? What is it about now? I think you touched a little bit on it on your introductory statements, but I was hoping you could expand a little more.
Yes, thank you. Two reasons really, and like I said in the introductory statement, it is that there isn't enough focus on the role that limitless deficit spending is playing in making our government unaccountable and unrepresentative of the American people. And that was probably the starting point. But it became the film that it was because as I was exploring the topic of this limitless debt spending role, I found that conversations and just communications around any topic that touched on politics and federal politics especially was so charged with partisanship that you really couldn't talk about the issues because people are just so polarized. So I made the film and covered the topics that I did to kind of reflect on how there's not as much partisanship in any of these issues as it seems. Campaign finance reform may be more popular of a topic amongst Democrats, and debt spending may be more popular of a topic among Republicans. And everybody hates lobbying is just a term. But universally, and especially amongst nonpartisan, you find that there is just this really broad consensus around the problems and the need for reform, and making the film to kind of show that. And it was important to me to kind of get education out there. And I'm not trying to necessarily, it would be great if, members of Congress were going to sit down and watch this film and say, oh, let's, make the priority reform today, but we all know that's never going to happen. So making a film that would, reach more of the general public, and also especially, as Maya touches on, reaching high school students and college students who are going to come up and have to make decisions about what they're going to do. People who feel unrepresented by the current system and are trying to figure out how it is that I can still get involved and make a meaningful impact. To have the second part of the film, which really shows ways that you can get involved that you might not have, learned from just watching, average media. That's why we made the film and focused on it the way we did.
Mm-hmm. Dave, question for you. Our national debt is $28 trillion and it's rising fast. The documentary talks about how unlimited federal debt insulates voters from the cost of corruption. I'm curious, do you agree with that statement? Do you see a connection between our ability to issue large sums of debt seemingly without consequence and public policy outcomes that don't exactly represent the will of the voters?
In general, I do believe there's a correlation. And to me, when we talk about fiscal sustainability, we really need to talk about two things. Not the total amount of debt. We need to talk about how much is the debt as a percentage of the economy. If you can grow the denominator faster than the numerator, you're making progress. We did that after World War II, but we're doing exactly the opposite now. And secondly, how much do we spend on interest as a percentage of the overall budget? Right now, that's not a big problem because we have historically low interest rates. But we also have an unsustainable monetary policy. We have artificially low interest rates because the Fed is holding them down and they're buying trillions of dollars of debt. So we don't have a true market with regard to what we're paying on interest with regard to federal securities. So I do think there's a correlation. I also think there's a correlation that we have three maladies in government. We have myopia, which is short-sightedness. We have tunnel vision, looking at one issue at a time without understanding the interconnectivity and the ripple effect. And we have self-interest, and that is re-election. That's what's going on. We're living for today. We're not taking steps to help create a better tomorrow. That's one of the issues that we have to come to grips with.
Mm-hmm. Maya, up until about 1999, Congress used to pass a budget resolution every year without fail, regardless of who was in the majority. The documentary links campaign finance to the breakdown in the annual congressional budget process. Do you agree with that? And can you talk about how Americans are actually harmed by the inability of the House and the Senate to agree on a budget?
Yeah, great question, because I do agree with that, but it was something I hadn't thoroughly understood the link between until I saw the film. And that is, as somebody who'd been working in this field for a long, long time, I think it was really clarifying for me. And it's such a great question because both the actual budget and all of our deficit spending are issues that don't tend to connect directly to people's lives. They don't see the connection, but they should, because it's deeply impactful on basically every aspect of their life, in that the overall budget and the fiscal health of the country are kind of the underpinnings of the economy and our national priorities. So just three quick examples. By not passing budgets, by not having any sense of the long-term trajectory other than where we currently are is unsustainable, there is little to no certainty for anybody who wants to plan. And that's young people or people near retirement wondering what fix is ultimately going to be put in place for Social Security. We know it needs to have changes, but how they can plan for their retirement based on that. Or a small business owner trying to figure out what kind of environment they'll be working on. There's no way for every other person in the country to plan with any certainty when a budget doesn't exist. That's number one. Number two, the fact that we don't pass budgets and don't have any fiscal objectives in the budget process allows us to continue to grow and grow this national debt. And that, of course, weakens us from an economic perspective, where it slows growth. Our standard of living today is probably lower than it would have been if we hadn't borrowed, particularly because we borrowed so much for consumption, not investment. Our ability to face future challenges is diminished. Our vulnerability on the geopolitical stage, as we continue to borrow from abroad, including from countries that we're not aligned with, is increasingly dangerous, as we're only coming to realize. and our ability to update our social contract and other things we should be thinking about due to the changing nature of work and other big globalization technological issues that we're going through. But we're not having these big questions because we're so indebted. That affects all of us. And it certainly affects our kids who are going to be entering a very, very different world than the ones we inherited, with both hands tied behind their back in terms of fiscal policy. And just the third reason it matters, we just borrowed trillions of dollars, rightly because of an emergency, but on top of lots of trillions of dollars borrowed wrongly during the economic expansion. And guess what's going on in Congress in terms of the budget process? Nothing. The date where we were supposed to be done coming up with our next budget came and went, and nobody noticed. House Budget Committee Chairman, Senate Budget Committee Chairman, barely a mention of the fact that they are frankly abdicating their responsibilities by not passing this budget. And that holds true for all members of Congress. But this all contributes to the really dangerous loss of trust that we have in our country for our leaders, for our institutions, and that trickles down and leads it to the loss of trust we have for each other. So as much as nobody goes home every night, except for probably all of us, and talks about the debt at the dinner table, it is affecting all of us as citizens in so many different parts of our fundamental kind of act as members of this national community. And it's really troubling to me how there's no leadership on this issue.
Great answer. I agree with you 100%. Bob, question for you. Former Congressman Justin Amash, an independent from Michigan, appears in the documentary and he says, and I quote, "Bipartisanship means everyone gets what they want." I literally stood up in my living room and went, yes, when I saw that. And he doesn't mean it as a compliment. It's a commentary on the lack of shared sacrifice in Congress. Right now, Democrats are trying to decide whether to negotiate with Republicans on an infrastructure bill. Is the congressman's quote a warning to deficit hawks like you and me and some of the others on this panel? Should we be concerned that bipartisanship, at least as it exists today, means larger deficits and more debt?
Yes, I think we definitely should be concerned, because the usual bipartisan compromise, or the more traditional bipartisan compromise, is, well, let's take the Democrat spending agenda and combine it with the Republican tax agenda. That's a bipartisan compromise. And of course, that's what leads to unsustainable and rising debt. Yes, we're entering a dangerous period with huge negotiations going on. And as Maya said, totally outside of the context of a budget. We haven't even seen a budget from the administration yet. So, we had the COVID bill, we've got the infrastructure / care economy plan, we've got another plan coming up. None of it presented yet in the context of an overall budget, which is, that's a problem. But when you talk about negotiating the infrastructure, here's one thing that I worry about. There's some talk about maybe splitting off the traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, highways, water projects, that sort of thing, because Republicans are more supportive of that than they are of some of the president's broader agenda, broader definition of infrastructure. So maybe we can get a bipartisan agreement if we focus on traditional infrastructure. They seem to be agreeable to $600 to $800 billion worth, which is a very large infrastructure bill by traditional standards. But okay, let's say they can agree on it. Where they get hung up on is they can't agree on how to pay for it. Republicans aren't going to go with Biden's corporate tax increase ideas. Biden has said that Republicans will say they might go for some user fees like a gas tax or a vehicle mileage tax. But that could run afoul of Biden's pledge not to raise taxes on anybody earning less than $400,000 a year. So maybe they reach that moment of the bipartisan compromise where they say, well, we really want to do this spending. We really want to have a big infrastructure bill. let's just not worry about how to pay for it. And so, we'll do that part of it later. So I do think that there's a very, they're all denying it, that this could be the ultimate outcome, but I think there is a danger that we could negotiate ourselves into just a huge deficit financed infrastructure bill.
Yeah, scary. Okay, so Dave, did you have?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up real quickly on something that both Maya and Bob said. Number one, the Congress has passed timely budgets and appropriations bills 4 times in my lifetime. 4 times in my lifetime. It is an F minus, okay? Secondly, there's tremendous abuse now of the budget reconciliation process. Budget reconciliation was supposed to be used to expedite and to facilitate tough decisions to reduce deficits and debt. And it's been used in the 21st century to do exactly the opposite. By Republicans to get tax cuts that exacerbate the problem, and by Democrats to get spending increases that exacerbate the problem. My latest op-ed in The Hill 2 days ago focuses on this. And the last thing is that we're spending all this money and there's no oversight. The Congress created a Congressional Oversight Commission for COVID. It's now spent several $1 trillion more. It's never appointed a chairman, and at least one of the other positions is vacant. So, things are just out of control from a multidimensional perspective.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Okay, so now that we've depressed ourselves by talking about all the problems, let's try and be a little bit more hopeful and optimistic, and let's talk about some solutions. And this next question, I'm actually going to give to all of our panelists because I'm sure everyone has got some thoughts to share on this subject. Several people on this panel have dedicated their entire careers to promoting fiscal responsibility in Washington. The movie mentions an example of a grassroots effort in support of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And at first blush, that might seem like a no-brainer for folks like us, but as they say, the devil is in the details. So my question is, do you support a balanced budget amendment, and what criteria would you construct around it? For example, there are some balanced budget amendments that prohibit tax increases, some that provide exceptions big enough to drive a truck through. Many states have balanced budget requirements, but their capital and operating budgets are distinctly separate, and the balanced budget requirement just applies to the operating side of their ledger. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts about a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution? I'm going to start with Andrew, then go to Dave, and then Maya and Bob.
Yes, I'm very supportive of, but when we say balanced budget amendment, the devil's in the detail, even in that wording, where it is, fiscal restraint, a phrase that Dave has taught me and others very well. A fiscal restraint is really the goal. It's not about balancing annually to what revenues are. It is that which could cause unintended consequences. It's about that you're restraining the rate of debt creation in proportion to the economy over time, with limited exceptions. And of course, there has to be exceptions. War is a national emergency. I realize that yes, Congress could always go against. They could just declare a national emergency at any point to keep the restriction from being in place. But I think that when we talk about an amendment, we can never lose sight of the fact that an amendment is the result of a huge public movement supporting it. It's not something that a cabal or or just a majority of senators and congressmen are just going to introduce one day and it's just going to get passed because they've got this nucleus of support. It's only going to happen when Congress is forced to do it, and that's why the movement of states to try and have their constitutional convention, to call for have a convention that would put a balanced budget amendment out there before the states to ratify is kind of the leading initiative for it right now. And there's not much in Congress. They'll debate probably 70 or 80 balanced budget amendments this year that will go nowhere in Congress. So don't yes, I'm a big supporter, but I always would say to people, don't focus so much on debating the details of a balanced budget, because what you need to do is to gain the overwhelming majority support and most people do support some sort of fiscal restraint, especially when you outline some of the details of it. So don't get lost in arguments about kind of the nuances, or that, that oh, they could just if you put a national emergency exception, that they'll just overturn it. If the overwhelming majority of Americans call for this and actually accomplish it, and 3/4 of states ratify it, that movement is what will keep Congress honest. And that's going to have to be an eternal movement of trying to keep, our representatives honest. So that's my answer.
Dave?
I am not for a balanced budget amendment, but I am strongly for a fiscal sustainability amendment.
What's the
And
difference?
what the difference is that we're not going to balance, and we don't need to balance revenues and expenses on a day-to-day basis. What we need to focus on is debt as a percentage of the economy and interest as a percentage of the budget. So I believe that we need an amendment that focuses on those factors, that sets goals, targets, and triggers to be able to get debt to GDP down to a reasonable and sustainable period over a period of time. And if you don't hit it, that there are consequences for not hitting it. There would be very limited exceptions. A formal declaration of war, which has not occurred since World War II, although we've had a number of conflicts since then, okay? Or certain events where there is a supermajority of Congress that vote to override it on an annual basis. In other words, you got to do it year by year, all right? I'm involved with two groups that are trying to call for a limited single issue constitutional convention that would be solely for the purposes of focusing on a fiscal sustainability amendment. Depending upon how you count the states, if South Carolina passes a resolution, which we're working on right now, we either have 28 or 34 of the needed 34 states. The model that is being followed is the model for the 17th Amendment, which was the direct election of senators, which got within one state of being able to call for a convention, which then forced the Congress to be able to do something because they don't want to lose power, they don't want to lose control. That's the model that we're trying to use. We don't need a convention, but we need pressure on the Congress such that if they don't act in a responsible and timely manner, that it could be taken out of their hands. And interestingly, the president has no role to play whatsoever other than potentially using the bully pulpit on any constitutional amendment, whether it originates in Congress or whether it originates through a constitutional convention. So strongly for a fiscal sustainability amendment, not for a balanced budget. And by the way, 49 of 50 states have a balanced budget requirement, but we've got a number of states that would go into bankruptcy if they could. It's not allowed under present law because they define a balanced budget as cash flow, cash in, cash out. They don't consider huge unfunded retirement obligations. And as a result, they're in much worse financial condition, even though they have the audacity to tell their citizens that they have a balanced budget. They're nowhere close to a balanced budget.
Maya?
Okay, I'm going to give a really mixed answer to this because I'm of two minds on what we should or shouldn't be doing. First point is agreed. I don't think the right metric is balanced budget per se. It's debt as a share of GDP and the direction in which we are going. So the most important thing is that your economy is growing faster than your debt. But so wrong metric. The idea of having fiscal objectives, metrics, absolutely critical. It's insane that we have basically an open-ended budget process right now with no constraints. Number two, I'm not a fan of a constitutional change right now because in this moment in history, it feels to me like we are rethinking everything from our core political systems to economic systems to, again, our loss of trust in each other. And I'm worried about the stability of the country. So it doesn't feel like the right moment to go and open up the Constitution. I'm not generally as opposed to them as I would just like to see things simmer down a little bit and for us to all get a little bit more on the same page. And that feels like a hard thing to do. I think it's really important that it treat taxes and spending equally. There are some people who think of fiscal responsibility as less spending. The way I look at it is you can have big government or small government and be either fiscally responsible by paying for what you want, offsetting new spending or tax cuts, or fiscally irresponsible by refusing to pay for those priorities, whatever they may be.
Right.
But I think the point of process is to put the size of government as a neutral and make sure that there is symmetry in how you treat these things. I will say I've always been struck by the hypocrisy of people who talk about wanting small government and then try to get there by refusing to raise taxes when their pledge or their promise should be not to raise spending. That's what makes government big, not paying for the spending that you have. So that's just kind of an aside note.
Mhm.
No matter what you come up with, it is important to have exemptions for emergencies, recessions, national disasters, attacks on the nation. But it's also important to tie that spending and borrowing at times where you should be borrowing, for instance, this past year, with longer term offsets. And so I think a budget process mechanism that requires borrowing in the short term be offset by pay fors in the long term would also be a really helpful way to move forward. 2 final points. I worry about how many people are big fans of the balanced budget amendments, but refuse to say how they would fill that in. I almost think the price of admission for being taken seriously as you should then say, and here's an example of how I believe we should stick to this restraint. Because I worry a lot of people use it as an excuse not to focus on the actual policies. And then the final point in favor of, we have seen in countries around the world, those that are most effective in being fiscally successful take simple to understand metrics and have the entire country buy into them. And it is a lot easier for the country to say, balance the budget or balance the budget over the business cycle than it is to give them all bumper stickers saying, put the debt as a share of GDP on a downward path so that it is sustainable, right? So there's something about that public, we can all be behind this one metric that actually has proven to be very effective. So there you go. That's the biggest wishy-washy answer someone could have given.
That's okay, Maya. I'm with you the whole way. Bob?
Okay, I'll give wishy-washy in a slightly different way. Back in the 1990s, the Concord Coalition did support a balanced budget to the Constitution. And we were quite vocal in that. And one of the arguments that we used to make, I certainly made it, was that the Congress would never be able to balance the budget without the backbone injected by a process like a constitutional amendment to force them to do it. It turns out that we were wrong. There was a balanced budget in the late 1990s. We had a surplus for 4 years. So, you know, our founding co-chairman, Warren Rudman, used to say a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution was a bad idea whose time has come. And our attitude about it now is it's a bad idea whose time has come and gone. I think that I agree with all of what Dave and Maya said about the importance of having a goal of debt to GDP. I think that is the right goal. And I think there should be consequences, look back mechanism or something where you could enforce that sort of, by a look back procedure. All of that I think should be done statutorily. It's not as strong as putting it in the Constitution, but to me that stuff is too detailed and specific for the Constitution. The Constitution, not being a piece of legislation, is more about general principles. So I worry about putting something like that in the Constitution. The other reason I worry about it is I worry about implementation and enforcement. For one thing, on the implementation side, we are so out of whack right now. We're so far out of not just balance, but the debt to GDP ratio is much higher than any of us on this panel thought it would be at this point, and headed higher. So I'm not exactly sure where you would, frankly, if you look at the numbers, the choices that we would have to make just to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio now are so very, very severe. I don't think people realize it. So I'm not going to go into them now, but just I really worry about the implementation. But the second thing is enforcement. I don't know how you would enforce it. Would the minority party in Congress go to court to say that the majority had passed a budget that wasn't, suppose they don't pass a budget at all? And
yeah, who has standing?
The thing is on autopilot. So the lawyer in me starts looking about implementation and enforcement questions, and I'm not sure it would work. The other final points on that are, it takes a long time to get a constitutional amendment adopted. I would like us to get, I would rather have that time debating the hard choices that we need to not balance the budget, but to get the debt to GDP ratio stabilized, rather than debating a process, a constitutional amendment, because even if we passed it, you still need to pass the tax increases or spending cuts that you would need to implement it. And, you know, I just think a better use of time would be debating the hard choices. As Rudy Penner, former CBO director, once famously said, the problem isn't the process, the problem is the problem.
Right, right. I was gonna say, on Capitol Hill, we used to bemoan a lot when we were on the budget committee staff that there was no budget jail, right? There are all these requirements that you should do this, you shall do this in law, you shall pass a budget resolution, you shall by this date, you know, and they just don't, and there is no consequence, there is no budget jail. So I hear what you're saying.
There has to be a consequence, and one illustrative consequence is that if you do have a constitutional amendment that has targets, triggers, and automatic enforcement mechanisms, and that would include both revenues and expenses if they don't hit it, all right, both sides of the ledger, and if they nonetheless violate it, then they could not stand for re-election.
Ooh, interesting. Anybody want to comment on that?
I would, who's going to bring the suit to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to disqualify a candidate?
It would be a constitutional provision. You wouldn't have to, you know, I mean, it's in the Constitution, and the Supreme Court is supposed to uphold the Constitution. So the whole idea is it would be a provision in the constitutional amendment.
I'm sure that the opposing party,
and all the more reason why you got to get it. You got to get the people to be behind it rather than the politicians, because the politicians wouldn't want to do that.
All right, Andrew, you had a comment.
I was saying, I'm sure the opposing party or whatever representative that was constitutionally, you know, barred from running would be quick to raise a suit to get that person to, you know, enforce that provision.
Mm-hmm.
But my only point is, we have due process of law, equal rights, phrases like that in the Constitution. They are litigated. So whether the budget complied with the stated goal percentage of GDP, that would then become a matter of litigation.
It's one of the problems with America. We have too much litigation. But, you know, it's the way, I mean, you know, you can do nothing. You can do nothing, which we're very adept at. And look where we've gotten by doing nothing. The politicians have to be, there has to be some forcing mechanism for them to do things that they don't want to do. And we can debate what that might be, whether it's statutory, constitutional, whatever, but there's got to be something, because the status quo just doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah, well, we agree on that.
Mm-hmm. Maya, I'm going to go to you on this one. Simpson-Bowles, the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, was an experiment in the art of the grand bargain. Everything was on the table: revenues and spending, taxes and entitlement programs, and it eventually collapsed under its own weight. In the film, you specifically talk about the need to first address the division and distrust that now exists among lawmakers. You just, in your opening comments, you talked about the 3 Ds. Is it time now for Congress to stop swinging for the fences like they tried in Simpson-Bowles, and instead focus on small ball victories that sort of tinker around the edges of reform? Or are there better ways to establish that sort of wellspring of trust and shared sacrifice that is so critical to making hard choices?
Yeah, it's a really important question to figure out what things need to be done to lay the foundation for the success in fiscal measures. Because right now we are in a moment where our politicians almost always, and almost all of them, but not all, but most, put politics before policy, immediate gratification before the long term, extreme purity of thought rather than compromise, and run away screaming from any tough choice. And those are the things you need to fix the fiscal situation, and those are the things that are the antithesis of this moment. So I think there are a number of things that need to change. The unique thing about Simpson-Bowles was actually they found it easier to have the sitting members of the commission get to yes, the bigger the package became. So once everybody felt certain that more things would get accomplished and you'd actually fix the problem and that everybody was part of the solution, there was more support even from the extremes, from Tom Coburn to Dick Durbin. And there was an incredible amount of diverse support on this. Well, how often did the New York Times and Wall Street Journal editorialize positively about something on the same day? Almost never. And there was a good deal of support all through different communities all around the country. What I think the biggest issue standing in the way of Simpson Bowles' success was political leadership. You did not have the support of the political leaders. You did of Boehner, Obama to some extent, and Hoyer, but there are a lot of leaders who are unwilling to really support this. And you've got to pull apart the reasons that stood in the way of that. And oftentimes you find that ideas you're railing against, like, oh, they're trying to steal your Social Security, oh, they're trying to raise your taxes, are better for the parties than actually solving those solutions. So here's where I think we are. We do need to do a lot of trust building and a lot of bipartisan relationship improving. It is terrible right now in terms of bipartisan true relationships and trust on Capitol Hill. And you know this, Tori, everybody on this call knows how bad it is right now. We have to improve that. I wish it were a moment to quote unquote go big and put in place a deal that's big enough to truly address the problem. But the problem's gotten worse in this decade. And that deal would be so huge, I don't think there's any political appetite for it. So unfortunately, I think instead of going big, we are probably left with go incremental. And again, I think I'm the queen of bad bumper stickers on this discussion because go incremental is not really inspiring. But one of the reasons I really like the Trust Act, which is bipartisan, bicameral, and that is one of the reasons I like it, but it takes each one of the trust funds that would be headed towards insolvency over the next 15 years and puts a commission on fixing that program in and of itself, not as a bigger part of the debt picture. And right now, that seems to have the most promise. I think we should look at all possibilities, another big debt commission, something about debt targets, but the Trust Act, which is a little bit more piecemeal, seems to be more doable at the moment. And again, I think people would have sticker shock if they saw how much you would need to have in savings to even stabilize the debt where it is today, which is much too high. And that would be much bigger than any of the debt deals you've even contemplated. And nobody remembers how to bring the debt down. They only know how to borrow right now. So just starting with let's pay for things, let's stick to pay-go, and good for the Biden administration for saying they want to pay for infrastructure. Now let's make that a credible package. But just starting with pay-go would be a good start, as well as looking at something like how to fix the trust fund, maybe a down payment. One final idea. I think we could put together a package that would offset the cost of the most recent $1.9 trillion economic bill. I think that's a number that we could get done. So maybe we go in small bites and compromise along the way. And those things should have both spending and revenues in them.
Okay, we're getting close to the end here, so I want to throw in some audience questions. And I'm going to make this a jump ball question to our panel. So some in the audience have suggested a number of reforms, including eliminating political party registration, term limits, replacing partisan redistricting with independent commissions to draw congressional district boundaries, eliminating the Electoral College. Do you think some or all of these reforms would be sufficient to amplify the voice of voters above the drive for campaign cash? Or are these just window dressing? Do they just miss the point? And Dave, you had your hand. I'll start with you.
Yeah, let me start with what we exposed to representative groups of voters in 2012 on political reforms. And we got well over 80% support across all segments of society, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, age groups, race, et cetera. There were three things. One, redistricting reform, where districts would be decided by independent commissions. The objective would be to maximize competition consistent with the Voting Rights Act rather than to minimize competition consistent with the Voting Rights Act. Secondly, integrated and open primaries. One primary, top two run off from the general election no matter what their party affiliation is. Number three, campaign finance reform, in particular focused on getting corporate and union money out, but there's other segments that you'd have to be able to deal with as well. And lastly, 12-year term limits. But the thing you have to do, and that got well over 80% support across the spectrum. The real question you have to ask yourself is, how do you get these things done? Some of these things are a responsibility of the states. For example, redistricting reform is a responsibility of the states, and most of the states have the political parties involved in that. Okay, primaries, the same thing. All right, campaign finance would probably take a constitutional amendment. Given the recent decision, and term limits would definitely take a constitutional amendment. And on the term limits, the general consensus was 12 years, long enough to where you have institutional memory, can get some seniority and things of that nature, but not so long that you make a career out of it and are looking to get a pension and retiree health care out of it.
Anybody else? No? Okay.
I think I think the redistricting reform ideas are really good. Some of them that have done the nonpartisan redistricting commission. So that's a great model. Term limits, you would have even more elections, so even more opportunity for campaign finance. So, I mean, you would have more, competitive elections. So I'm not real sure about that, but I agree with Dave. I mean, maybe like the 12-year limit or something might be.
Or maybe longer terms instead of every 2 years.
I wouldn't. The 246 in the Constitution sounds pretty good to me.
Got it. So this question I want to ask to both Andrew, because you've been out in the field, and Bob, you've been out in the field. I worry that Americans are just too disengaged from politics and especially from budget matters to care about the problems that this film exposes. In the film, Professor Lessig specifically mentions the politics of resignation. Andrew, you've been in the field. Bob, you run a grassroots organization. How do we help voters connect action or inaction in Washington, D.C. to their daily lives? And how do we get them to care about federal debt and deficits?
I think you have to connect it to, their daily life. The reason that I got involved in this was directly from my experience with the last documentary, which is about the modern history of Detroit and why Detroit was experiencing so many local problems, and how many of those problems tie back to just the brokenness of our Congress and what allows for that to happen. And I think, on a daily basis, people are struggling with housing, healthcare, education. Those are probably three of the biggest pain points that any American has to deal with. The fast rising costs of these things, and they're directly tied to Congress's actions and inaction on these policies. They're making it more expensive in all these areas. And I've always felt that debt is a tough topic because people can't connect to it. They don't, most people, some people budget, a lot of people don't. And then just thinking about trillions is pretty much an impossible concept. So you have to point to their own personal impact of why is it that, housing, education, healthcare have all just about tripled in 20 years? Well, it's because, Congress is raising the cost of these things by subsidizing them so hugely and unaccountably. And even the wealth gap, that is also, they're not taxing to support the spending that they have. And that, impacts that. So find the issue that they care about and connect it back to how budgeting impacts it.
I think that this is actually one of the most difficult things about this issue, being concerned about this issue, because on any given day, deficit spending is going to be more attractive to people than not. Because these are the easy things to do politically, is to increase spending on something that you might want, or cut your taxes. So for anybody who wants to make the case, it's easy to say this is, the debt is going to affect you today in a positive way by, this sort of thing. So I think that and what we try to emphasize is that what concerns you in your daily life should also be something about the future. Some corner of your daily life concern needs to be, okay, what happens today, but what happens down the road? If you're not at all concerned about the future of your country, the future of your family, you're probably not going to be concerned about this issue. But people that are concerned about things like climate change or national defense, that, worry about things that, you might not be able to say, how is this going to affect me today? They're still worried about it because they realize that we have to have a sustainable future, whether you're talking about sustainable in the fiscal sense or sustainable in the environmental sense or sustainable as a national security proposition. I mean, what you need to have, you need to have the confidence that the policies that you're put in place are going to last, because no matter how good or well-intentioned the policies are, if what you've got is unsustainable, as we talk about it, if it's relying on perpetually higher debt, then you can look at the numbers and you can say, well, this is going to all collapse. So how does that help? So I think what the trick is to be able to make that the concern about the future something that you do incorporate into your daily lives. And one analogy that I like to give, it's like health, talk about it like health concerns. If you sit around on the couch, eating donuts, smoking cigarettes, you might have a great time. You know, might do that for a long time. And I can't tell you when that would catch up to you and, you know, give you the heart attack when you stand up. But you know that over time, those are not healthy health habits.
Right.
So just as people should have healthy physical habits, people should have healthy fiscal habits. And that's one way to think about incorporating the future into the present.
Dave?
I think a key word is stewardship. This country was founded on a number of principles and values that we've strayed from. And one of the big principles and values is stewardship, which is not just generating positive results today, not just leaving things better off when you leave than when you came, but better positioned for the future. We are failing miserably with regard to that. And people need to understand when debt to GDP goes up to unreasonable and unsustainable levels, that has a negative effect on economic growth. It has a negative effect on job opportunities. It has a negative effect on our ability to fund our military. It has a negative effect in a number of different ways. And that's one of the things I talk about in my book, American 2040, is, we're living for today. We are absolutely mortgaging our future in a way that threatens our position as a superpower in the world and threatens our domestic tranquility at home. It is real. And when I was on the road, whether I be with Bob on the Fiscal Wake Up Tour, on the 10 Million a Minute Tour, if you will, one of the last slides that I would typically use is a picture of my family, including my grandkids, because that's what it's about. I'm not worried about me. I'm not too worried about my kids. I'm very worried about my country and my grandkids.
Absolutely.
And if people don't care about that, they're never going to get it.
Right.
I'll just real quick. I know we need to get on the next subject or wrap up, but I think that all those things work together, and you have to look at the audience member. The far-sighted people who are looking, out for the future and thinking in that manner, certainly, address it that way to them. But you really can see the immediate impacts too in your day-to-day life, and for people that motivate them, and I think that's the more general wide public. There are a lot of immediate impacts. It's not about that this is going to catch up to you in 10 years. Maybe it was going to catch up to us in 1970, 1980, but we're 40 years into this. The reason that pharmaceutical drugs cost what they cost is because it was a debt. Medicare PD was only enabled by debt. The invasions of war on Iraq, the impacts are just so widespread at this point of irresponsible debt-laden spending that you can connect both the long-term and the short-term and really bring it home to people.
Mm-hmm. All right, I've got two quick questions. First one's going to go to Maya, and then Andrew, I'm going to finish up with you. Maya, there had a question from the audience. What's the relationship between the groups represented on this panel and groups like No Labels and the Problem Solvers Caucus? Do you all work together?
Okay, before I jump into that, I just want to say on that stewardship point that Dave made, yes, yes, yes. This is just such a failure of stewardship, and I don't know whether to be sad or mad or scared about it, but we got to wake up and we got to ask our leaders to lead better. It's just really important. So the relationship is informally incredibly strong. I'll only speak for our organization, but I think this is true of everybody, that those groups where self-selected people have decided to work in a bipartisan manner are exactly the ones that are most open to working on these issues. Not always, because this stuff is hard. And as we've already said, there are times that bipartisan groups do compromise by saying, I'll give you yours if you give me mine, and we'll pass the bill into the future. That happens a lot. But the groups where people are saying they're willing to work with the different perspectives and have respect for the diversity of ideas and perspectives in this country, which is what makes us great after all. Those are the groups that are most promising. I'll give a big shout out to another group that we work with, which is the 30 and 30, which is a group in the House led by Jody Arrington of Texas and Scott Peters of California, that came together around COVID and said, we both recognize that we need to borrow money now, and it will increase the debt, but to fight the pandemic and the recession. And we also realize that our debt is already too high, and we need to come together once the economy is strong enough and work together in bipartisan ways to bring that debt back down. And I think that group is another that is focused solely on fiscal issues that we work really closely with and shows a lot of great promise on that issue of stewardship that we were just talking about.
Good. Andrew, last question. What's next? You can't make a film like this and then walk away. Do you have plans for a follow-up?
Thanks for asking. I don't have current plans just because they take so much energy. So when I was done with the last one, I said I'd never make another one. And being this far along with this one, I have that same feeling. But I certainly have some unresolved issues in the making of it. And I would say that my focus and what I'd like to have fit into this film, but there just wasn't time, was the degree to which our media and kind of communications is being influenced by this spending. You know, it's not just the three branches of government we see, it's the fourth branch of government as well, where, you know, there's all of these structures that exist, you know, that are trying to influence the narrative that people don't see. And, you know, a commentator, two of your questions one talks about, you know, deductions that people are able to take, and then for nonprofits like political 501c3s that might not, you know, they might be lobbying in a way, but they're not. People are able to take deductions for kind of getting the type of government that they want, and then there's also just it's how the message is getting to us, because the polarization is almost manufactured. It is the spending. 3/4 of the campaign finance funds that are raised, as a rule of thumb, are going into media and communication. So the message is being so influenced that, you know, we're hearing this hyper polarized message because it makes control easier for the parties. And I don't think people understand the process by which it's reaching to them well enough. They just see the output of it on Facebook or on the news that they're listening to, that in being more informed about that process would make them just a more informed citizen, and they wouldn't be so quick to, you know, whether it's vote or, you know, be mad at their neighbor because of some, you know, the way that talking points are kind of focus grouped and then put out to us. So I think that would be the next thing that I would focus on.
Great idea for somebody else if you don't pick it up. So we're out of time. I want to say thank you to everybody, especially to our panelists today. Andrew, Dave, Maya, Bob, thank you so much for your time and expertise. We're all better for it. Look for this video to be posted on Concord Coalition's website in the next couple of days, and feel free to share it with friends and family. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.